All right, I want to welcome everybody to the Slave Dwelling Project Conference. We are very excited for our next session. I'm just going to give another minute or two for people to log on. My name is John Williams, and I am a board member of the Slave Dwelling Project. I've been involved with the project since 2014, and I'm currently a principal of an alternative school in Rockingham County, North Carolina. And so we will start in just another minute or so. But very excited that you're here. And again, we'll just kind of wait for people to join us, and then we will get started.
I apologize. I've got to shut my door.
Okay, and looking on your end, guys, can you see our participants joining us yet? Okay. All right, we'll wait for some folks to come. All right, let's see. We got Nicole here. Great. Okay, welcome, Nicole. All right, guys. So Nicole is here, and just wanted to welcome Nicole. Welcome everybody. I'm seeing that I don't know if we have any other participants just yet.
Amy Peck from Prospect Park, Brooklyn.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, we will go ahead and get started. Let me see here. Okay, great. All right, so my name is, okay, there's great. All right, here we go. Okay, good. So we got started to get some few people here. We're a system here, but thank you guys for. All right, 7 others here. Good, excellent. All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. My name is John Williams, and I am a board member of the Slave Dwelling Project. I've been involved with the Slave Dwelling Project since 2014, and I have organized 6 different educational visits and have been involved in 4 different conferences. And so very excited about the work that Joe is doing, Slave Dwelling Project is doing, very excited about our next session. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over without further ado. We have Cheryl Yateman, we have Regina Foptum, and we have Peter Friesen from the Historic St. Mary's City. And so we're going to turn it over. I think Cheryl or Regina, you may be first. So thank you for joining us, guys. Very excited you're here, and thanks so much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, John. And just want to say hello to Meredith Taylor, a neighbor just down the road from us. And so welcome. And anyways, I'm going to share a screen because I work with archaeologists, and you always have to use slides. So I'll be right with you. Okay. So, excuse me. So this is the name of the site, our presentation, Can You Decolonize a Colonial Site? And my job, I'm the executive director at the museum. And so I'm just going to give a little introduction to what we're all talking about, and each in our different capacities at Historic St. Mary's City. we're talking about decolonizing. We are a museum that interprets the first colonial capital of Maryland. And so we want to tell you about our adventures in trying to do this. So, excuse me. So again, a little bit about historic St. Mary City. We are located in Southern Maryland, which is about 2 hours south of Washington, D.C. on the Western Shore. We're an outdoor museum, living history and archaeology. And the commission, our governing board, was created in 1966. We are a state agency. And in 1997, we became an independent agency, and we are affiliated with our neighbors next door, St. Mary's College of Maryland, which is a small liberal arts college. Again, our mission is to preserve and protect, you can read it there, but about the archaeological and historical record, which really focuses on the first colonial capital. And we have the ability to develop the site, but really the purpose in telling you the mission is when this was created, when the commission was created, it was really focused on the colonial capital. And we really knew very, very little about it. I'm from New England. We have a lot of records, a lot of diaries, a lot of letters and things that can tell you about the past. Colonial Maryland is still a little bit of a foreign country, and that's what Historic St. Mary City Commission was formed to do, was to begin to look into, I said, what was actually here. And so that's why the purpose is here: identify, document, study, curate, and interpret the record of St. Mary City with an emphasis on the 17th century. And that's really what we've done for about 50 years. And let's see, I'm trying to forward my slides are a little jumpy here. So when the museum began, like I said, they started looking at archaeology, began in 1971. And the museum developed 4 major sites. These are the first ones. They're not the only ones now, but they're the 4 major sites. And if you were to come on a 4th grade tour, and for most of you who work in museums, you know school tours are a large part of what you do, you would see these 4 sites. So one is the Woodland Indian Hamlet, and we can talk a little bit about that. But right when the museum began, and up until very recently, and Peter will talk about this, the hamlet really was about the moment of contact. So we did talk a little bit about Native American life before contact, but it also, we had I said, it was really about that moment of contact and the Europeans coming in, the English settlers coming in 1634. Our story here in Southern Maryland is really about the tobacco economy. And so we have Godiah Spray Tobacco Plantation, which is supposed to be a representation of a working tobacco plantation. It is the only place that we do first-person interpretation. We do focus on the story of indentured servants and planters. That was what was really unique about Historic St. Mary City when it began back in the 1970s. As the research began in the 60s and 70s, that the researchers here were really looking into that social history of the people who are underrepresented. And I mean that in a different context than we do today, those unnamed poor individuals who are coming as indentured servants from England. And also talking about the cycle of the tobacco economy during the year. Another example of one of our prime sites is the Maryland Dove, and that is a small, tall ship. It's about 76 feet long that represents the tobacco trade in the late 17th century. Ships going back and forth between England, bringing goods here to Maryland. And that's what we talk about with the students, but the students also get to learn about, they said, life on board, what immigration might have been like, but again, more about the tobacco trade. And then the town center, St. Mary City was the colonial capital of the colony of Maryland. And so we have a print house. We talk about government documents, what might have been produced here, an ordinary, which is a sort of inn and tavern. And then we have a storehouse where we talk about what people might have traded their tobacco for. So those are the 4 main sites that we have here. And again, you can see the Woodland Indian Hamlet has been here, but again, I would say that it really was focusing on that moment of contact. So these are primarily European stories that we were focusing on before. Some of the stories that are really important and central to our story, but were, as I said here, sort of stories on the periphery, were Matthias de Souza. And this is one of the things that fascinated me when I first came here, the idea that an indentured man of African descent becomes a free man. He was indentured to the Jesuits, becomes a free man, and works as a fur trader, and tells a story of the how slavery developed here. That's one of the things we can talk about. And not everybody realizes that in the 17th century that slavery was not an institution in the way that it was in the 18th century, but it develops here, and the laws that are institutionalize it are passed at St. Mary's City. Again, the Woodland Indians, the period that we're talking about, again, it was relational to the English settlers, how they helped them come in, how they helped them learn about how to use the local resources. Not exactly a Thanksgiving story, but much more about cooperation and peace in the early years, which will unravel relatively quickly. And then talking about the enslaved people, which we really didn't do. Nicole Moore, who's a major part of this conference, I brought her here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the party line was, in a way, that there weren't that many enslaved people, and it wasn't a large part of the economy. But of course, it's an institution that develops here, and that's one of the stories that we really need to tell. So I said, these are stories that were here, but we're not being told in the same way that the European stories were. So just a little background on myself and where I was coming in when I came to historic St. Mary's City. I came from Hannibal, Missouri. I'm not from there, but I was the director of the Mark Twain Museum in Hannibal. And I had been through an interesting process of just beginning to tell some of the African-American stories related to Mark Twain. I mean, Mark Twain was a humanist. He wrote Huckleberry Finn. It's always a controversial book, but it was different, controversial for different reasons in the 19th century, but we wanted to talk about that. And that was a bit of a fraught conversation in Hannibal. And we managed to get through a story about why Huck Finn was controversial, talking about African-American history. I said, bringing people into the museum who did not feel welcome before. It's a much smaller place than historic St. Mary's City. But as I'm getting ready to leave, this is late 2008, if anybody remembers back to that, just before the economy goes off the rails, I get a call before I'm leaving for historic St. Mary's City. We've just been cut $125,000. We're thinking, this is the staff who are at historic St. Mary's City, we're thinking of closing down the Indian hamlet to save money. And that seemed like a really bad choice of me at the time. I wasn't quite sure. I didn't know the place very well. I was coming in. Like I said, I hadn't even begun my job, and said, let's just hold off. I'll be there in a week or so. And that seemed like a very bad choice to displace the Indians once again from their place on the site. And so when I got in, like I said, I could see a number of problems, not just budget, but budget is policy. And when you make choices about what you're funding, you're making choices about what's important, right? So I came into St. Mary's City, and I could see that there were a number of issues here. And having just been through what I've been through in Hannibal, that we were, and still are, a largely white organization telling a European story. But I go to a lot of conferences, and I hear people often saying, I can't get my executive director to go along with this. I really can't explain it to the leadership. But even for a leader who wants to make change, it isn't as simple as it seems all the time, because you really need to sell your case to people who work in the institution, people who are on the ground every day, and the people who've been there a long time in some cases. So that's something that's well worth considering, and how to go about it. And I'm not saying that I had all the answers, or I, did the best job. I've worked through this, and I think that's part of what we're here to talk about, how we made changes in our museum. And that's why three of us, one as the executive director, education, and then marketing, are trying to explain to you how we work together to make change, because it can only happen when everybody's bought in. So as I said, fits and starts in laying the groundwork. I worked in a very small museum before. It was much easier in some ways to communicate with the 4 other full-time staff who were there. And when I came, there was a very well thought out education program, interpretive plan, and the staff were very well trained in it. But what I did see again was a lack of story related to African Americans. And how do you begin to help an organization that's been around for 50 years think about how to begin to incorporate that story? So I mentioned Nicole Moore. She's part of this conference. I met her just about the same time I was coming in, and we presented at a conference together, and she had interpreted an enslaved person in first person. And I really wanted her to come and talk to the lead interpreters of each site and begin to understand how to begin that conversation. But I don't think I did the best job in preparing them, because she came in and some of the staff, I won't say all the staff, but some of the staff really didn't even know what I was trying to accomplish, and sort of what I call retreated into fact. You know, well, how many this and how many that? And really it was a challenge to get them to talk about the techniques. I certainly know that some of them understood. I said, but that was an effort that I made when I first got here. And I don't think it served her or us very well, but at least it was a start. Then I heard about Joe McGill, and he had been in the county. He had been up at Sodley Plantation, but he was all the way down in Lynchburg, Virginia, the next time I heard he was going to be staying somewhere. So I went down to Sweetwater College in Lynchburg, Virginia, and met Joe and asked him to come, and he did come and stay overnight in our slave quarter. And that was at the beginning of the development of the Struggle for Freedom exhibit. We had this underway. We have the last, as far as we know, extant slave quarter in the state of Maryland. But of course, we know from this conference, a lot of quarters exist that we don't know are quarters. But anyways, we started the development of that site. That is open, and Joe came back to help us celebrate some of that later in time, from the time he stayed over. And then we also started, I got some money through AT&T to develop a partnership with the Reginald Lewis Museum, which is in Baltimore, Maryland. And that is primarily, it's an African-American history museum. And so what I thought was we could have I called it cultural exchange, and this was not code for anything, but you have kids who go to school in an urban environment. We have kids here in a rural environment, and I wanted to bring them each to each museum to see a different environment, and particularly for St. Mary's County kids to go to a museum that was entirely African-American history, and for the kids who live in the city to come down and see this rural site and to learn some of the stories that are really important to African-American history in the state of Maryland. And I ran out of the money. Eventually I ran out of the money. The program didn't continue, but I think that those trips made a difference. And I did hear from some people, parents or people in the community afterwards, that they remembered that. And so hopefully that was a good start too. Then, like I said, sometimes you just have to get the right staff in place. And so I would say, when you listen to Peter, when you listen to Cheryl talking about what they do and the way that they brought change in their areas, you'll see that they are deeply committed to telling a more inclusive story at Historic St. Mary's City. And you have to have the cooperation from the staff, because they said they're going to have to carry this out. We all know that people in museums are passionate, and they have to believe in what they're doing to do it well. And like I said, so I think we all got on the same page as far as that. That was not having to convince them. That was just giving them an opportunity to do the things that they knew they needed to do. And one of the things that helped us move along in this direction is a new visitor center. So this is a building that was designed. We started design just after I got here, and then designed exhibits that were primarily, again, focused on European story and archaeology. And then in some ways, fortunately, the construction got delayed. And we're just starting construction at the beginning of next year. But when the staff started to look at the exhibits that we had designed 10 years ago, they said, this is really not where public history is anymore, not where we need our institution to be, and not what we want, the story we want to communicate anymore to the community. So we began to identify community partners, people that I knew from being a leader in the community, and who I knew were deeply engaged, like I said, African Americans, people who represented people with disabilities, Native community, and brought them together to begin to help us understand how to tell our story and how to help tell their story. Our staff at the leadership level is all white, and so we needed help. We're not authorities to share the African American story, the Native American story, and so we really needed guidance and input to be able to do that in any way that was representative and fair. And so we've been in this process for 3 years, working with the community. We're getting towards the completion of the exhibit design. We still have some refinement to do, but I think that we're going to realize the goal, which is that everybody walks in the museum, at least who helped with it, and feels that we got it right, or at least mostly right, as far as telling the stories and making everybody feel represented. And what I mean at the last point, the multifaceted change across the museum is, as we're going through this process, and the people who are on the exhibit team, so as Director of Research, as Peter, Director of Education, Cheryl, as Director of Marketing, our conservator, our new curator, we began to see, of course, how much change we brought about in our narrative, and that's not reflected yet on the rest of our campus. And so we know that we have to rewrite the master interpretive plan. We have to rewrite the education manual. We have to change our signage. We've also been trying to change who works here. And I think some of the message is getting out. We are getting some more diverse people working on site, but we have a long way to go till we're representative of the community. But we know that we've put our foot in the path. We're a little ways down it, and we're committed to continuing this work into the future. So one of the things, of course, that we all know that happened that I think created a real mandate, I would say at least for Historic St. Mary City, if not for the entire museum field, was the murder of George Floyd. And I'll say I'm a little embarrassed to tell you, but it took Cheryl and Peter and Travis to come to me and say, we really need to make a statement. We really need to be out there. There are a lot of museums doing this, colleges, and I admit I was a little slow to get on board with it. I didn't resist it. They had to bring it to my attention. So I did write a statement. Cheryl put it on the website, and a number of people did write to me and said, thank you. And I think, again, making a public statement was important for our community to recognize that Historic St. Mary City takes a position, that it cares, that it recognizes suffering, and that we wanted to be part of the conversation. So I think that was, I commend the staff for making sure that happened. Like I said, I didn't resist it, but it was also something they had to bring to my attention. So I think that was a great contribution on their part. And then, like I said, this is a picture of us in some of the conversation. That's Gabrielle Tyack, who used to work at the National Museum of the American Indian. And she came in to talk to us about, right now, we're working on a project we call People to People. And so she's helped guide us in some of the discussion of how to even begin a project, archaeological investigation in partnership with Native communities, and just reminding us to always start on an equal foot, to pay our consultants as professional staff, to be cognizant of our level of authority, which is only that we can help facilitate storytelling and to get that started. And of course, one of the things that we know now, I said, and I've been sort of talking about, is a museum-wide commitment to making change. And I know that our educational staff across the board, our leadership, are dedicated to this. I walk out on site and I can hear the interpretive staff talking about what they've learned, the research they've done, the stories that they bring to the fore. And so I'm really confident that we can continue to develop and improve. So I think that's my last slide. And thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Regina. And next up, I think, is Cheryl next, Regina?
Yes. No, Peter is next. Excuse me.
Peter's next. Okay. All right. I'll get Peter up here for you. All right. Welcome, Peter.
Welcome. Thank you, John. And thank you, Gina. And thank you, everyone else, for attending our presentation, especially I see some of our friends and neighbors from St. Mary's County, Meredith and Nancy. So hello. And I am the Director of Education. And some of what Gina discussed, I will go a little bit more detail in and how I went about these aspects of changing our narrative at Historic St. Mary's City from a colonial story to a more inclusive story, because many of the things that Gina talked about were baked into how the narrative is. It was slow changes. It was meeting with staff, having conversations to change minds, because there are a number of people who worked here for many, many years and didn't always think that how we were doing certain things was necessarily wrong, or why do we have to change it, and how do we change it, and what evidence do we do to do that? And then it's been snowballing ever since, which has been very exciting. Some background on me: I've been part of the living history world for over 15 years, having done internships at Valley Forge, working at Colonial Williamsburg. And I actually started here not as the director of education, but as an assistant supervisor, portraying an indentured servant on our working tobacco plantation. And Gina asked me to come into this position after a number of years of working at the plantation. And I think this was part of her, like she mentioned earlier, of when she brought Nicole in and other things of how does we adjust the change in the museum. And she really wanted somebody who engaged with the public on a regular basis to help lead that change. So that was very nice to be thought of in that regard. And some of the things that have changed me personally and how I was able to think about these changes of telling a colonial story, or telling a story that is about colonialism, but doesn't put it on a pedestal and brings everyone else's voice and story to the forefront so people can see these different aspects of history that were started 400 years ago and still have impact on our lives today. So this is just a short timeline. One, was the visit with Nicole Moore, and then of course Joseph McGill when he came to sleep at our slave quarter and had nice conversations with him. And then in 14, having thought about some of the pushback that some staff gave from those conversations, like Gina mentioned, which is looking at the facts. Well, in St. Mary's City, only 1% of 2% of the labor force was enslaved. So why do we need to talk about it? It wasn't that big a deal. That comes later. That comes in the 1700s. So looking at those different things, and that's where I started doing some research. So in 2015, I began doing some research. I'll talk more about that. 2016, more importantly, was another, I think, putting these puzzle pieces of staffing together was when our new director of research and collections was hired. Well, at that time, he wasn't in that position, but he was the head archaeologist. And he came in wanting to tell a more complete story that wasn't just the great white man, and to look at colonialism in a different lens. And that really helped me as the director of education in my department. Another one was having George McDaniel, who was the executive director of the plantation, but I know it's down in South Carolina. He came and visited, and he did some work with us at Historic St. Mary's City, and he gave me some insights about, working with his staff and getting them prepared to give tours and stories about including African-American story, the enslaved, and not just talking about the Great White House. And then Gina mentioned the working with community partners. And another thing that just very recently, I think these things are constantly coming up, is I'm a member of the Association of Living History, Farm and Agriculture Museums. And at this year's annual conference, Christy Coleman, executive director of Jamestown Yorktown, gave the keynote speech. And she talked about changing the narrative. And so I kind of took my title of my speech from that, because it really gave me a perspective of what we're doing. Is it decolonization, or is it so much changing the narrative to be more inclusive? And that's how I look at it. So research, that is the basis of everything, and going back and looking at primary sources. And so here is one of the first things that I started to do was I'm going to relook at this whole idea of slavery in the 17th century, as far as I was concerned. And how do we change the narrative? How do we go from looking at it as there weren't that many slaves to why we need to talk about it and why it's important in the 17th century? And this law, the Act Concerning Negroes and Other Slaves, was passed in Maryland in 1664. It's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, legislative codifications of race-based slavery in what becomes the United States. And that was really important to think about that when you look at this document, that people made a choice to write these things. And from there, I was like, what other literature is out there? Want to look at, find any secondary sources I can find. Secondary sources are also useful to look at the historiography, how people have looked at the subject over time and how that's changed. And I came across this really great article. I highly recommend it, by Jonathan Alpert. It's called "The Origin of Slavery in the United States, the Maryland Precedent." And granted, it was published in 1970, but this has been very influential, so much so that I include it as extra reading for my staff when they want to know more about this topic, because he lays out the legal history of race-based slavery in Maryland in the 17th century in a very succinct, easy to digest way, that I think speaks to the idea of choice, that people are making these cognitive choices, and how racism is being inserted into these choices because the ways the laws keep getting rewritten and rewritten after certain incidences happen in the past causes that the strictening of the laws to be more and more racist, and to really ensure that there is a power structure that puts a certain group of people on top and another group of people on the bottom. That was unique to this part of the world and world history. And with that knowledge, and then was able to rewrite our section of the training manual that went from a 2-page document about slavery in Maryland in the 17th century to what I wrote, very, knowing my audience, that I have a diverse audience. So some of them are retired school teachers or who are volunteering, who don't view themselves as professional historians. How can I get this information in a way that's easy for them? So I wrote a little 5-page paper for them and gave them hints of what they can talk about and where. If you're at the waterfront, you can talk about this, or if you're in town center, you can talk about it like this. And that was very helpful, especially for some of my staff who, even to this day, admit that they were hesitant and resisted this change. But once I was able to talk with them and present this information, that yes, you're right, there wasn't that many, but more importantly, the legal, cultural, and economic foundations for race-based slavery are established in the 17th century. That's what we need to talk about, because it's those laws that are impacting the lives of the people in the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, and even today. And so that gave people this something that they could grab onto, that made sense to them, that it's not just a number, it's these other aspects of society. So that was really great when that happened. Next up is another great exhibit, which was the Struggle for Freedom exhibit. When Joe came to visit us, this is where he slept. I don't know if my cursor shows it, but this is the dwelling that he actually slept in, this duplex right here. And based off the work of a graduate student, Terry Brock, who now has moved on and is a professor at Wake Forest, helped a lot of this exhibit's based off of his PhD dissertation. And so now it's an active exhibit. It works really well. And we're bring many people to visit this site. And I've learned a lot in giving some tours. And one of the tours that I gave, that I've used to help train my staff and thinking about these difficult histories and where people are coming from, was with the Dunbar scholars that Gina discussed. And we brought some of them down. And when I would start off at our working tobacco plantation and talk about the idea of what a plantation means in the 1600s, that it was newly conquered land that was used for agriculture purposes, and the laws in the 1600s. And then we'll shift over to this slave dwelling that was built in the 19th century, right before the Civil War broke out, and how slavery changed over that time and how it was about to end, and then the lives of African Americans after the Civil War. So we discover those things in this topic. But when I was bringing these group of students to this building, I had, and we're waiting for them to get off the bus, and I'm sitting there, and they see there's the big house, and we're walking down this path that's going to go to this other building. And one of the young ladies, I think is one of the bravest things anyone has ever done. She came up to me, a complete stranger. She's probably 15, 16 years old. And here I am, a white man in your late 30s, early 40s. And she's like, "Hey, mister, I'm afraid to go in here." And I'm like, "You're afraid to go in here?" And it got me thinking. I'm like, well, if you don't mind me asking, I don't want to come off as obtuse, but what are you afraid of? Are you afraid of this is an old building and it's spooky and full of ghosts? Or are you afraid to go in this building because it is a place where people of African descent like yourself were held as property and forced to work and had no freedom? And so this building is a place that your ancestors possibly lived in a building like this at some point in time. And she was like, "Well, both, actually." And I said, "Well, that's okay to be afraid. It's okay to have those feelings when you're going into a place like this. This should be a place that brings up different feelings. And we shouldn't view feelings as negative in the sense of if you're afraid, that's a good thing, or feeling sorrow or whatnot. I mean, if you don't feel anything, that's a problem, but having some feeling, that means there's a connection and you have some empathy. And if you don't have empathy, I don't think you can really learn from the past, because you got to be able to put your feet in other people's shoes. And she shared that with me. And I asked, do you mind if we share that with the rest of the group? You don't have to say, I'll say it. I won't point you out. That way, I imagine other of your classmates are feeling this apprehension. And she said, sure. So I told everybody, and you could see these students, you could see them just like, okay, I'm not the only one who's feeling this way. Somebody else is. And I even was honest with them and said, it makes me uncomfortable coming in here knowing what happened, but we have to confront it. So let's go ahead and do this as a group. And we did. And we had a great conversation about the building, about the lives of people, and the struggle for freedom and how it continues. And the teacher and I had a great conversation going afterwards. And many of these students, this is, coming from urban areas to come to the country is really different. And then to even go into one of these buildings is very different. So that's another way that we are starting to break down those barriers. And from that, I was able to use that story to talk to my staff and tell my staff that, hey, when you're bringing a group to this exhibit on a tour, you can bring up emotions. It's okay to talk about your feelings. You can say that sometimes I am uncomfortable about this because you're an old white lady, and even though you disagree with slavery and all that, just that concept makes it difficult. How can I tell this story to African Americans? But every place is going to be unique, so you can tell the unique history to that place that other people who are visiting from elsewhere don't know. So that gives you some ability to tell those stories. So it really helped a lot of our guides to get more comfortable talking with other people about this topic and going to this place. So that was very important. Another thing that we did to start delving into difficult history and looking at our past is we have a tour called Sin and Scandal. And it started off, it was talking more about the deviant behaviors at the time, like extramarital affairs or drunkenness and whatnot. And we've been doing very well. And then one year, one of my staff, and this is where, like Regina said, having staff buy-in, came up and proposed the idea of hey, why don't we change this tour a little bit? We know there was an incident in the 17th century of a white woman marrying an enslaved man, and what happens because of that, and that it was written into law that what would happen in this case, and then it actually happened, and then the law changed because of this incident. And this was a woman named Eleanor Butler and her husband Charles. And Eleanor Butler was, as the story is, was indentured to Lord Baltimore. And the law in 1664 stated that if a English or Christian woman married an African enslaved man, she would be enslaved to her husband's master for the life of her husband. And so would any children from the marriage. And so because of this, Eleanor is then made a slave. Even though Lord Baltimore tries to talk her out of it, they have children, they are enslaved. And it's not until the mid 1700s that descendants of the Butler family are able to sue for their freedom based off of the fact that their grandmother was a free white woman at one point. So it's a really interesting story, and the law quickly changes, and you can see the law change where you start the law to a point where even the word white is used for the first time in the 1692 law, where they amend this because they said too many masters were encouraging their white servants to marry the enslaved men, and they didn't want this happening. And it spells it out very clearly, and you can see this is anti-miscegenation, and that doesn't end until Loving v. Virginia. So we have a very clear example of how racist laws written 400 years ago are impacting people's lives in the 20th century. I mean, for me and for many of the college students that come over are I say, like, you know, that's your grandparents' age. That law didn't get changed until your grandparents were in their 20s or 30s. And that really like blows their mind that history is not that far away. And so we're really proud of that we were able to make and adapt that story for this program in a way that is honest and makes people think about the past that they don't always do. Also, with our school tours, moving forward with COVID, we developed new programs, virtual programs, and the staff took it upon themselves to make sure to really highlight how slavery was a choice, how race-based slavery was put into law. And so we spell it out in a video. So these are two screenshots from that video. And one of the screenshots is one of our objects in our collection, which was a shackle that was used to hold somebody, an enslaved person. And so we can see these aspects of the law using the primary sources. The staff is, and we're moving forward to tell this story that these things happened here. Even though there was this great other thing that happened with religious toleration, this other law enslaving people happened around the same time. And then the other part of colonialism that sometimes, you know, that we always have to talk about and is the Native people. And we had that community partners meeting when developing our new exhibits that are all coming on, that we're still in the process of designing for our new visitor center that Gina mentioned. And one of the things that came out of that from the members of the Piscataway tribe that came to our meeting is, one, don't look at us as like people who are just one with nature or oversimplified, just looking at like how we do like make corn or make a canoe, but that we have a complex society that interacts with other complex societies. And also we have treaties that talk about colonialism and how we were impacted by colonialism. And so the staff took it upon themselves to really look at that. And what do these sources say and what do they not say? And helping students understand the biases in these sources, the primary sources. And I think that's another way of helping to maybe change the narrative, decolonize, if you want to use that term, or understand colonialism, that it is a violent process, and understanding that you know, the plantation system, the very beginnings of the plantation system is violence, and that you're taking over conquered land to use for agriculture purposes. And the Native people, the Yakamako and the Piscataway, are the people who are being dislodged from their land for the plantations that then eventually are manned or operated. The labor is done by enslaved people from Africa. Part of that then goes into our recent discovery of St. Mary's Fort, which is the embodiment of the violence. A fort is a military object for military purposes of taking over land. And so this St. Mary's Fort allowed us to develop a tour, one, to help the archaeologists so they can continue to dig, and we in the education department can engage with the public while we take them on site, but then look at this relationship between Native people and colonial relationship, and how that has changed over time. And we take the people out, we look at the tours, and we use the primary sources to help illustrate how colonialism was a racist system. And a clear example of that is one of the quotes I like to use from a treaty that was signed with some of the Native peoples here, both in 1666 and later on in 1692. And I'm just going to read one quick excerpt because I think, you know, when you, again, the primary sources is where it's at, that really speaks to the racism and in many ways, I'm sure many of you would agree that we hear these statements even today. For as much as the English cannot easily distinguish one Indian from another, that no Indian shall come onto any English plantation painted, and that all the Indians shall be bound to call out aloud before they come within 300 pieces of any Englishman's clear ground, and lay down their arms, whether guns, bows, or arrows, or any other weapon. That speaks a lot about the power structure between the colonists and the native people and the inherent racism in this process. And so unpacking that with the public is a very important thing to do. And it is difficult, but when we take these documents and show them to people, they have that aha moment. They start putting the connections together and maybe thinking about their own selves and their own lives of maybe how they can do something different. And so it really tells not just the history, but the place, because this is the place where those laws were implemented. So it's the power of place, it's the power of primary sources on this changing landscapes tour, which is great, and we love doing it. The other aspect is, letting Native people have a whole place or have a location where we can speak fully for the Native people. Gina mentioned that we used to talk about this like almost Kumbaya Thanksgiving, where the English colonists and the Yakamoko people lived in peace for a number of years. The English people lived in a Indian longhouse. And so here we have a picture of how it would have been, how we used to have it set up. You can see there's obviously lots of English things. It looks like an English person's living there. And then we said, let's tell a more full story and focus just on the Yakamoko. And it doesn't have to be right at colonization with 1634, but let's talk about what happened before, what was leading up to it, and give a more dynamic story. So we took all these things out of there and started talking about it, trade networks, political, family structure, and that's where we're moving forward with our interpretation at the Woodland Indian Hamlet. So that way, visitors will see a full Native American story, not a mixture or this moment where they think, oh, everyone lived in peace and that's the way it was. Because I've heard visitors tell me that that's what they thought the history is. And, that might have been the case for like 6 or 7 months. But, within 9 years, we have the chief of the Yakamoko murdered by an English person. So it wasn't peaceful. And then we have our new visitor center. So this is just a layout. I think I'm going a little long, so I apologize, Cheryl. Moving forward to the future, we got our new visitor center, the Maryland Heritage Interpretive Center, and we're telling a more complete story, starting thousands of years ago with Native people, and not just talking about their lifeways, but their politics, their culture, their religion, and making them a dynamic people. And we'll be moving through time, and this screenshot is really nice view of how we will be talking about Native people and then transitioning to colonialism, and I think tall ships is another example of colonialism and violence, of either taking over land or forcefully moving people to another land. So ships are very evocative of that. But then we're going to continue the story on throughout the zip into the 20th century to remind people that the Piscataway people are still here, to remind people that African Americans have struggled and persevered and added to our cultural fabric and weren't just some blip on the radar. So it's in bringing in our community partners to tell that story. Another one is we were inspired by the Ford's Theater Museum. They established foundational truths about what the Civil War is. And we want to do that here to talk about what is colonialism, what does it impact on society, how does it impact the African Americans, how does it impact Native Americans, how does it impact all of us. And from there, we'll design a new master plan and interpretive plan. We're really looking forward to that process because we think there are certain things that we need to think about the past that has impacted the good and the bad. You should never just focus on one or the other because most of us aren't all bad or all good, but we're all human. And so that's how I see it of changing the landscape and the education department. And Cheryl worked in the education department. She has helped me out with many of these things, and we continue to work together in marketing. And she's been doing fun, wonderful things with changing that landscape and bringing perspective for the whole museum and putting a public face out there in a way that we are all proud of. So I'll let Cheryl take it away from here.
Thanks, Peter. I appreciate it. And I have no problem with you going long because there was a lot of information in there that was like fantastic. So I appreciate that. Just gonna try and share mine also. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. So what I'm going to talk about, because I'm the external relations manager for Historic St. Mary City. So I'm going to just talk about my own, not my own. I'm going to talk about the process and like the steps that I've taken to begin to decolonize the museum through social media, because that's a lot of what I do is I mainly focus my time on like the Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, really on those three. So I'll just start. Just to give a little quick background, which I probably should have done before I went to this slide, but I have a theater background. So that was my major in theater. So it's not even, I was not expecting to be in a museum. But I think that background has kind of made me a lot more interested into like the human element in the stories. Before I came here, I had worked with a children's theater for about like 15 years, touring from like New Jersey all the way down to North Carolina. So I was seeing a lot of different elements. You know, we're going into public schools, private schools, like city, country, just going all around. And then started here actually as a museum guide about 13 years ago. From a guide, I then also helped with interpretation. I then started working in the office with group tours and did public programs. I mean, like a lot of other museum people, you know, you have a lot of different hats that you wear over the years. And so now here I am, right? So with this image, when I came into the position, that position had been open for a few years. So we were, I would say probably, you know, we're all kind of trying to like help pick up a little bit and help fill in different pieces, but weren't really thinking of it as a whole. And so with this image, the thing I always think about now, looking back, is like what message is being sent to the audience, you know?
Cheryl,
Yes,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't think you've shared your slides. So
no way, really?
Yes,
oh
ma'am.
my gosh, that's so. Thank you. Okay. Well, oh no. Oh, you're right. I'm so silly. So sorry. So sorry.
Not a problem. Thank you so much.
Is that me now? You can see it. Is that we're good?
There we go. Yeah, we're good. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I just got started and no one needs to see just this the whole time. All right. So the big question is like what message is being sent to the audience by the images that we're putting out to the public? And from looking from this, you know, it's like you've got two really lovely lovely ladies there, a colonial costume, but it's not really telling a full story. So what we needed to do, we had to first recognize the issue. And as Peter and Regina have both mentioned, that we were in the process of working on the new visitor center. And so when I was first brought in this position, I was then kind of tagged to be on that team, part of that team to help develop and look over the older exhibits that had originally been put together and try and reimagine and rethink it. And part of that, actually, we had sorry, my chair's squeaky. We hired a consultant to bring together like local stakeholders and to talk with them and kind of work as an evaluator to discuss with them and ask them questions about what they thought of the museum and what their, you know, just different opinions on some things. And I was tasked to be the person in the room when that conversation was happening. So I was the representative of the museum, but I was to be solely I was not to be a participant, but to just really listen. So I sat in the back corner, took my notes, and paid attention. And something really strong came out of that, was a big recognition. This is just a quote from that evaluator's work, is that the local leader stakeholder group, they were given a folder of materials, and that had different brochures on our programming. And you can see here, it says the brochures almost exclusively feature pictures of white colonists, costume interpreters. And one person even said, I'm not seeing one single image here that relates to me. And I feel very fortunate that that group of people were comfortable enough and to be open and honest and to be vocal, because they were 100% right. Everything in there definitely told one story. And we really needed to kind of have that slap to recognize that we need to outwardly make that change, so that other people will understand we are looking to make that change. So the truths of that meeting were that, those materials had an unrecognized bias, because it had been vetted. People had seen them within the institution, and no one really realized what the problem was. The programs spoken about in colonial terms, which negated the diverse groupings that now live in this area that lived in this area that's now called Maryland. We even had like summer camps. There were colonial kids camps, and that people of color were rarely, if ever, mentioned. And this would include in a lot of our social media posts. We did a lot of comment posts about the Calvert family, really a lot about people of prestige who were the backers, the financial backers of the colony, but didn't really get a lot deeper. So from that, it's about taking responsibility, to just take responsibility in what I say is your own complicity. Because you have to recognize that you have been a part of this machine, or this institution, and you've been a part of everything, or I was a part of everything that had gone out. And I had seen some of the materials that were out. And you can't fix a problem if you don't recognize that problem. And it's not about, I could say all I want, right? Is that when I started and when I was trained, the training materials, like you've heard Peter and Regina both say, the training materials were really focused on being we don't really talk about that. I even remember the education director at that time, who's not Peter, but saying, we do not talk about the enslaved. They had a list of things that we shouldn't really discuss. And this was probably, like I said, about 14 years ago. And so when, having the number of people that we have that have worked at this place for so long and are so embedded, it's just embedded into your training and into your brain, that you need to have that wake up moment to realize that, yes, we need to make a really big change. And it's not about pointing fingers. I mean, I know I'm talking about the training, but it's not about that. It's about as a person, we should have recognized that these other issues were not being addressed properly. What the issue is about recognizing, it's about listening, and it's about changing. So the thing that I really think a lot on is about unconscious bias. I found this graphic because I personally am much more of a visual person. So I just like to have something to think on. But because what all of that kind of came down to is that we all had this very unconscious bias that we just didn't recognize. And the first thing that you have to do before you can move forward is recognize what that is. You're going to have difficult conversations, like Peter was mentioning. I mean, we had a training session when I was in the group tours, where we were talking to the tour guides about how we were going to start talking about these things more on the tours. And one of the guides actually, you know, raised their hand and said, well, but, you know, we don't have time to talk about all of that. And they just thought, oh, well, okay, let's have this discussion, because we do have time, and we need to make it if we don't. So we've got to make sure that is out there. Just in a little way to start recognizing what your biases might be. I mean, I had gone to another conference through, it was either AAM or, oh gosh, I can't remember, but where they were talking specifically about biases and saying that, you know, it's really good to even do like online quizzes, not like BuzzFeed, but there are some actual like ones that are out there to try and just start making you realize what you're not thinking about. And like I said, having difficult conversations, reading diverse literature, challenging on here, like challenging assumptions, traditions, and to practice empathy. I think this really graphic for me, like hits a lot. So where to begin, right? So we found out I have this glaring problem. So I went back kind of to the beginning of like what everything should be off of for an external relations, which would be our in-house style guide. And that is more like a language-based one. So I worked with both education, like Peter, and the research department to come up with a more robust guide. And thankfully, as Regina said, it's really good to have buy-in from your executive director. So I'm very thankful to have her behind there always saying, telling me kind of, it's okay, you can do this. So this is mainly to ensure that those within the museum are all using the same language and that we're all working towards the same goal. And from that, we kind of left behind that concept. We don't talk about that much. This didn't happen here. We don't really know much about it. We're trying to move on. And there, you know, this is still like, I feel a work in progress because, you know, their terminology, like our language changes all the time. And so it's just finding the words that we use to discuss certain issues, or just making sure that we are all using the same words, basically. Then I also, even though I'm most of the person that does the social media, I kind of had put them together for myself as social media guidelines to make really clear goals for myself and for any future staff that might be working on it. And something important within that guideline is to really talk about how you need to approach subjects. And make it a very strong point in those guidelines that, you know, you really want to talk about all the different stories and not just have a very slanted focus. Because if that's embedded in that document, anyone that's looking at it is then going to be relying on that. So what does the audience see, or what were they seeing? And this is just more for anyone that's kind of wanting to start and look over your own materials or look over your own things. But it's really taking a strong inner look at each piece of material. Really taking a fresh eye to everything. We redid our website recently, thankfully, because again, like that website, looking over what it was versus what it is, what it was very filled with white colonial faces and white colonial stories. And today I think it has a little bit more, at least image-wise, a little bit more diversity. We highlight some of the other sites, like Regina mentioned, you know, the Struggle for Freedom exhibit. We've got, we talked about the St. John's site exhibit that has some different things that happened inside that space. Also looking at the Instagram, Facebook, you know, the three that I focus on, and this is just for me, you might have your own media pieces that you work with. But I took a look over my Facebook, and this is when I had taken it over. I took a look over it, and a lot of it was talking about the plantation, which that word in itself can be very problematic to some people. And how do you approach that? How do you know, but looking at the images that you're showing, the stories that you're telling. And there was a real lack of stories about the Native population, or just any people of color. And so it, recognizing that, I think just recognizing, I'm probably going to say that a number of times, because I think before you can move forward in any way, you have to understand what your issue is. And also, like I said, the printed materials as well, like our brochures and flyers that the stakeholders were seeing, were also very slanted. So, like I said, with the images, what message is being given to an audience? And with this image that's being shown, that top one, that's actually an older one. We're really very focused on authenticity, very focused on showing the colonial life, very focused on showing the challenges of that life, which is, what happened. But I think there were definitely people being left out of that story. What images are being used to portray your museum or your space? I've started trying to highlight, children using the space in a different way, because we're not only a 17th century focused living history museum, we're also an outdoor space that it has a really lovely natural setting. And so I've tried to highlight a little bit more and find those things within your site that kind of make it a little bit more user friendly, because it's a big space here for families to come and just let their children kind of run around and have a really good time. And are your photos telling the whole story? Like, do you feel like they're really including everyone? These are just some things, just points to think on. And these notes, so when you're trying to change over your media, or what you're writing, or you're putting out the outward facing information to the public, is to be sure to fully explain the story. And by that, I mean, like, you can understand very well what the museum story is and where you're trying to go with a particular piece. And the case that I think of is, I was on vacation, and so another person had done a video, and they put it up, and it was set at the plantation, and it was a person talking about working in the garden and how the garden is medicinal, and which is fine. But the person in particular was actually a woman of color, and she was wearing what is an actual 17th century costume, but it's what's called a garden bodice. So it's just a very loose fitting top. She had an apron and a petticoat and had something around her hair. And so from that video, because it was not explained who she was, what she was doing, that she was portraying, I believe she was portraying a freed woman, because that was that site is a first person site. But regardless of whatever she is portraying, or whoever she is portraying, you need to fully explain that story. We had people that were really not happy about that one. So coming into that, point number 2 is to be vocal. So when that came out, and I saw it because it was not vetted through me before it went out, I called around to the different people, said, can you guys just take this down or change it or put something up there? Sharing that full history and trying to be more mindful might not be popular with everyone within your institution. It might not be popular with everyone on your media platforms, but this isn't about popularity. It's about, I guess in essence it is, but it's really more about telling the story right, and getting that information out to the public and giving educational information out. So is everyone on board? Make sure everyone at your institution, or try your best to have people in your institution on board, because as I mentioned, that in that case, the person who did that video they did not see any problem with it. There were a couple other people on staff who also didn't see any problem with it, and they wouldn't edit the post. And I went back and forth with them over the phone, because again, I was on vacation, but that, this wasn't okay. that we need to do better, and that we're trying to do better, and this has now taken us about a million steps back. And what their arguments were with is that, oh, this is just a slice of life in that time. Like, this is the way we've always done it, you know. But again, they weren't recognizing their own biases. They were not recognizing that they hadn't fully told their story or that person's story, and they were making assumptions about their audience. And that's when I come to my last point on here is, what is your audience not saying? Because a lot of times in social media, we think like, oh, you know, people are going to comment on it, or the haters are going to come on, or whatever you're thinking. But to me, that day I learned it's not just about what people are saying, but it's what people aren't saying. Because we had pardon me, we had people complaining about that, but they were not complaining on social. They were complaining to the director. And just always be aware, your audience is not always going to tell you what the problem is. You need to figure that out and be aware. So sorry, I've got something in my throat. I'm going to take a drink real quick, and I have a huge water jug, so I apologize. So do the work. Story of Historic St. Mary City isn't solely about a short span of time and the privileged few. Excuse me. Find what makes your space relevant and think on, what are your stories? What are you trying to tell? Some just different resources that I've used are just different readings, or our state archives. Wow. I think as the air conditioner kicked on. Just be aware it's a slanted narrative. The state archives are, right? As Peter said. I might have to have Peter take over. Learning for Justice, I started using that a lot. It is a teaching site. I mean, it's meant for educational tools. But because we're mostly an educational museum, I found this really helped a lot in how to start framing things. So sorry. The last book, Indigenous People's History of the United States, I would recommend reading that. I mean, that's just my opinion, you know. Oh my gosh, sorry. Criticism. So when you're on social, you're going to get the whataboutisms. The whatever was actually about whatever, you know. And people are going to push back a little bit sometimes. And really, this depends on what your institution is, I guess. I mean, if you don't. But I found that I respond, I try and keep as polite as I can. I don't appreciate, I will hide posts like someone's comment if they say something extremely negative or out of the conversation, because I don't feel it's helpful. But critiques, I've also had people make comments on some things that I've posted, you know, because this is all a learning process. And I had posted something on a Juneteenth post, and I'd vetted it through a few people. This was a couple of years ago. I vetted it through some people and said, like, what do you think about this? And they brought up a couple things, and I'd edited it. And I put it out, and then someone responded to it and kind of gave me a little, like, really, you know, you should have done better on this. And rather than taking that personally, and I then responded to them and said that I'd like to talk with them offline. I mean, not offline, but in private message. And so we chatted, and they were 100%, they were right, you know. So if you do get critiques that are actual critiques, like I would say respond, have dialogue with them, and edit. It's much better to admit your fault, you know, and to grow and to be prepared to be challenged. But as I said, there in a good way, and don't also automatically assume what people are responding to on Facebook or like, you know, Instagram in their comments, what they're saying, because you shouldn't make an assumption on what someone else is trying, what their point is trying to be. Sometimes people have a very hard time putting it out. I mean, I know I do. Also in those times, I've done the same thing, just gone offline, chatted with, I mean, not offline. I've gone like through personal message, chatted with them, found out. And in almost all those situations, like we've had a really good dialogue, and I've learned a lot from people out there. So it's larger than an individual. I like to say, because it's not about me. It's not really about Peter, or it's not about Regina. This is about having equity across the board in your institution, having equity and showing what stories you're telling and whose history you're sharing. And I just think it's always about challenging yourself. You know, I'm constantly trying. And I know that this isn't like a, hey, I've reached my end goal. This is all a work in progress, to try and further tell the stories. And it's research, and it's like, you know, editing and looking over, but yeah, I mean, the work doesn't end, but it's still worthwhile, because ultimately you're sharing this knowledge with people. And that was my final. So I made it through with my throat. So thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And I'm going to go ahead and put Regina and Peter back on here. I think that we have got around 14 minutes for some Q&A as questions. You guys can put them in the chat, and then I will also display them on the screen. So the first one, these are just some comments here. All right. And let me look to see if we have questions yet. All right. Well, I actually can start you guys off with a question. First of all, just great presentation and great work that you guys are doing at St. Mary's. But, you know, with all the work being done, I was just wondering, too, has there been an effort to diversify your staff? You know, we've got, you know, you guys are recognizing your biases, but just also wondering about how inclusive you've been with, you know, diversifying your staff, and also, you know, other stakeholders that you've included in your work.
Peter, I thought you might have something to say about this. You're muted.
Sure, I can just say something. We do want to diversify, and we have tried. One, I like to say Cheryl has helped us with rewriting advertisements to make sure that the verbiage is written in a way that makes it so people do know that they're welcome to apply, that we want to have a diverse workforce. And fortunately, we've had some more diversity in the last couple of years than we've had ever since I've started working here, as far as the public, the staff that engage with the public on a regular basis. I mentioned the Sin and Scandal tour. I think one of the key things that we were able to make that change is because we currently have a very talented young man who's African American on our staff, and he was willing to do this role, and I wanted to make sure he was okay with doing this, because it is stressful and it can be hard portraying an enslaved person. I've been to enough conferences with African American interpreters who talk about that and the challenges mentally and emotionally and all that. So he was willing to do it, and him and the staff worked on the staging and everything together, and that's been useful. We also had a young woman who's a Piscataway member, and she no longer is working with us. She wanted to pursue some other things, and there's some distance stuff, but she's willing to come back and continue to work with us in the past. And she opened my eyes to some things. She said some things that, you know, that made me think again about like where we need to go forward with telling the Native American story. And so with Gina, you know, talking to Gina about this, is in our master plan that we're getting ready to finalize, part of that goal is to eventually, hopefully, do what Plymouth Plantation has done and have it set up so that our Native village is fully run and interpreted by Native peoples, not white people, where we are right now. So that is a lofty goal, a worthwhile goal, and it's going to take some work, but we hope to get there. So that's kind of, and I'll let you know.
So, John, I just wanted to respond. So when we had some leadership positions, we had a new director of research and collections and a new curator. And I'll take whatever, you know, criticism comes my way. We were trying to find people of color in these positions. I think there's a long, and there was a young man, William Polly, who talked earlier today in the conference about getting a pipeline in place for people who work in certain types of careers, like I said, where there is a lack of diversity. And so I delayed, I put out a search for the director. I'm very happy that Travis Parno has joined us, but he had to wait a number of months. I put out the advertisement a number of times, reached out to people, like I said, and with our curator, our 17th century story is not familiar to a lot of people in general. And then also, like I said, so I mean, even when we're trying to find the leadership positions, that it makes it very clear that we have to start earlier than the hiring process to get people into positions so that they're, you know, they can be effective in a job that the type of job sometimes that we're looking for. You know, and there may be more people of color, like I said, or diverse background in a position like Peter's, but in some of them, it's not easy to find it. And maybe I'm not looking in the right place. So I'm happy to hear more about that. But we're trying, and I'm hoping eventually when we become better known for being more inclusive, we'll be the type of place that people would want to work to help be part of the change. So.
Absolutely. All right, great. Thank you guys so much. And looks like we got a question from Joe. It says, what can we do together in 2022?
We're on board for whatever, Joe.
I'm sure we can figure something out. Let's meet up after the conference is over and we're rested from all the hard work you're doing, and let's have a conversation, see what we can do.
Yeah. Sounds good. All right. Well, we can wait. We've got just a few minutes. Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl.
Sorry, there was a question. I would take it to Regina because I saw one early on during Regina's presentation. There was someone asked when the MHIC was going to.
Okay, so
there we go. That's it. When the date for the new visitor center. Thank you.
So we're still working on the exhibits. We're at about 75% design. We'll continue to work on those. The construction is going to begin in February of 22. It's funded, and then it will continue into late 23, and then we hope to open on a date that's significant for our site, which is Maryland Day, which is March 25th, 2024. So everybody's invited. And that's so part of the interpretive center. I think I mentioned when we were in there and realizing, working on these exhibits with the community, how much that building has to spill out onto the rest of the site to change the signage, to change the entire narrative. So we're hoping also rebranding. We're looking at that now. We're working with a company from Baltimore. Because if we're talking about these changes, I'm not sure they're entirely apparent when you come here today, but we're hoping with the MHIC, with the new visitor center, with new signage, a logo doesn't change anything, but you know, all the interpretive changes in the narrative and what's going on. Like I said, I think by 2024, you can't miss the change in the narrative. I think we're still in process with that, and we always will be. But 2024, March 2024. So.
All right, great. Thank you, Adrian. And then I've got one. I'm going back to the chat to see. It was a question from Meredith Taylor. Any chance of bringing back the Dunbar Scholars Program? Student exchange sounded great.
Yeah, so Meredith, I would love to. It's a matter of money. And it was really just about the bus, because the Dunbar Scholars are a leadership program through Dunbar High School in partnership with the Reginald Lewis Museum. And then there was a program at Great Mills High School, which is a local high school, not far from where Historic St. Mary City is. And it happened that in the leadership program at Great Mills, that it was all African-American students who signed up for it. And so my Rotary group helped support that. And so these were sort of self-selected students, and those were the exchanges. I didn't go into the high schools. I took these 2 leadership programs because I looked at Reginald Lewis, who was a really, he went to Harvard Law, African-American, comes back, helps the community, first African-American business person who has a company worth $1 billion. I mean, he's a big deal. You know, he dies young, and the museum is named after him. And then we have Lord Baltimore, who, for failings, I mean, he's a human being. He did start with, he was a leader, and he offered freedom of conscience for Christians. So that was different in his world. So that's sort of how I made the connection between the 2. So if Meredith, I know you write grants, if we can work together to get some money, I'd love to put that back into gear.
All right, great. And actually, Meredith had another question that was later in the chat. It says, are you incorporating the information from Alpert's research on the origin of slavery? Peter, what about the enslaved natives?
All right, good question. Yeah, so that document, I bring it up all the time with my staff, and so it's I don't make it required reading, but when staff after they get through the initial amount of information, that's like a secondary piece of information. Okay, so you after a year of being here, here's this, take this on, read this, see how you can incorporate it, and help giving the staff some, especially the staff that were trained to be historians, so that way it makes it easier for them to understand that, because I don't want anybody to feel that they can't do something, because you can. You just need somebody to help you do it. And then when it comes to enslaving natives, that's something that staff at the Women in Hamlet can discuss. We are incorporating some of that into the HIC. And I'm sure that's something that me and Cheryl could probably come up with as well later on. But that is something that we do discuss. And I do mention it in my training materials for staff about how some Native peoples were enslaved and some weren't. And even later on in the treaty, how the enslaved people were forced to capture runaway Africans. So that's also part of the treaty. So it gets very complicated when looking at this subject. So.
Great, thank you, Peter. Just looking back over the chat, I think I may have one more question. All right, this was from Adrian earlier. And just thanks for the humility in this presentation, very much appreciated. I'm also really interested in your relationship and input from the local indigenous populations have changed the Hamlet exhibit.
Well, you're muted, Gina.
Okay, that's you, Peter.
Oh, okay. well, like one of them, like the big change that I mentioned in my presentation of taking out all the English and having one of the longhouses like the English and living in it. That came, a lot of that directly came from a conversation we had with the young woman who is Piscataway, who worked on site and knew how we did things, and he was like, maybe, she gave us a big list of things to change, and I was like, this is one thing I can do immediately that's really low-hanging fruit that we can address, which we've done, and we even had our first training with our guys to go over that information with them, so that way they're prepared in how we're doing that change. Other things is where Gina, myself, the Director of Research and Collections, and Cheryl do meet with leadership of the local indigenous people and trying to build a relationship and have more input from them and hopefully more participation, especially like I was mentioning earlier with having the whole site interpreted and run by Native people.
All right, great. Okay, so we've got about 2 more minutes. Any final thoughts from our presenters and speakers today, just to kind of close up for the presentation?
Like I said, I just, as like I said, the director, I'm always hoggy with the time too. But anyway, I think you can just see why it takes somebody like, I can't do this by myself, and not that I would ever claim to be able to do anything here by myself, but you need people like Peter, who are very interested in digging into the history, understanding it, is always handing us something to read. And I mean that in the most positive way. He's always trying to understand more. And then someone like Cheryl, who is very sensitive, and maybe it's your theater background, but the sensitivity to language, the sensitivity to people, she really keeps us on the straight and narrow and has a beautiful way of responding to people, even when their input is not always beautiful.
Great. Well, Cheryl and Peter, anything else?
Thank you for having us. And I've already seen a couple presentations, and I look forward to more presentations later on throughout the week. And best of luck to anybody and everybody, especially those who are beginning the process of trying to change or have leadership problems or staff issues with who want to make these changes. And hopefully we gave you some insights of ways that we did it. Maybe they'll work for you, or maybe you can spin it into your own version to make that happen.
Yeah, and one more thing. Thanks, Joe. And it shows what one person can do with an idea.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Cheryl, Peter, and Regina, thank you so much for being a part of our conference. And thanks to all our participants here today. Very excited for the rest of the conference and hope you guys enjoy. And so thank you again so much for today.
Right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see you in 2024, Adrian.
Yeah. Thank you.